The town of Dry Creek had once been alive, bustling with wagons and laughter, with the sound of hammers striking nails and horses clattering down Main Street. But the railroad had changed everything, leaving it behind like an old boot tossed. On the trail, and one by one, the people packed their belongings and followed the iron rails to someplace better, someplace newer, until only silence and dust remained silence, and her, Clara. She had been born in this town. Her hands had known the feel of its wooden beams, and her feet the grit of its dirt streets, and though every neighbor had begged her to come along, though the preacher had warned her nothing but ghosts would linger once the train whistle faded, Clara had stayed, for in her heart she believed some things weren't meant to be abandoned. Not the graves of her parents in the little cemetery behind the chapel, not the orchard her father had planted with his own two hands, not the home where her mother's lullabies still seemed to hang in the rafters, and so she stayed, day after day, repairing broken fences, drawing water from the well, watching the horizon for a face she knew would never return, because the one she'd loved, the cowboy who had promised her a future, had ridden away long ago, chasing cattle and coin, leaving her with only a whisper that he'd come back someday, but someday never came. Not until that fateful evening, when the sun hung low, bleeding orange fire into the sky, and Clara stood on the porch of the old saloon, her shawl wrapped tight against the wind, staring out at a world that had forgotten her, when she heard it, the sound that once made her heart skip, the rhythmic thud of hooves across the empty plain. A single rider cutting through the twilight haze, and as the figure drew closer, hat brim low, shoulders broad, she felt her breath catch in her throat, for though the years had hardened his jaw, though the road had carved lines into his sunburnt face, she would have known him anywhere. Luke Callahan, the cowboy who had been her everything, the boy who had once stolen apples from her father's orchard just to make her laugh, the man who had left when she needed him most, and as he reined his horse to a stop, dust swirling around him like a storm, Clara's heart warred between rage and relief, between all the years she had cursed his name and all the nights she had prayed for him to return. But before she could speak, before she could let the flood of emotions spill, he looked at her with eyes as tired as the prairie itself and said, his voice low, steady, and breaking all at once, "I know everyone else left, Clara, but I stayed for you." And the words fell heavy into the hollow silence of Dry Creek, shattering her resolve, because though she wanted to scream, to demand where he had been when she needed him most, she also wanted to fall into the arms that had once felt like home. And as the wind whistled through the empty town, the past and present collided on that dusty street, and Clara realized that sometimes the hardest part of staying isn't the loneliness, it's daring to hope that someone might still come back. That night, the stars stretched endless over Dry Creek, the kind of stars you only see when the world around you is gone still, and Clara sat across from Luke at the long-abandoned saloon bar, where the dust of years lay thick on bottles no one had touched, the lantern between them casting a soft glow that couldn't burn away the shadows of what they had lost, and silence pressed between them heavier than any words, until finally she spoke, her voice sharp but trembling. "Why now? Why come back when the town's gone, and I've got nothing left but ghosts?" And Luke leaned back, his hat set on the counter, running a hand over his weathered face as though he could scrape away the guilt carved into his bones, and he said, "Because I was a fool, Clara, because I thought chasing cattle, chasing money, chasing the road would fill the emptiness inside me. But all it did was remind me of the one thing I left behind that mattered, you." And his words hit like a thunderclap, making Clara's hands tighten around her shawl, her heart screaming to believe him but her scars refusing to let go, and she snapped back, tears threatening her voice. "You left me to bury my father alone. You left me to keep this town breathing, while everyone else gave up. You left me when I needed you most. Luke, why should I believe you now?" And for a long moment he didn't answer, only stared at the lantern light flickering in his whiskey glass, before finally meeting her eyes and whispering, "Because this time, I'm not asking for a second chance at us, Clara. I'm asking for a chance to make it right, even if it means building back everything you lost with my own two hands." And in that moment, Clara saw something in his gaze she hadn't before, not the reckless boy who had ridden away, but a man who had carried his regrets like stones and finally laid them down. And though anger still burned inside her, another flame stirred too, one she thought had gone out long ago. And when the wind rattled the saloon doors and the empty town moaned like a ghost, she realized she didn't want to spend the rest of her days as the last soul clinging to a dying place. Not if there was a chance to breathe life back into it. Not if there was a chance to no longer do it alone. And so she whispered, softer than the night itself, if you stayed for me, then prove it, Luke. Don't just ride and stay. Stay when it's hard. Stay when the winter comes. Stay until the church bells ring again. And Luke stood, crossing the space between them in slow, steady steps, his shadow falling over her like a promise, and he cupped her face with calloused hands, his voice raw. I'll stay, Clara. For the first time in my life, I'll stay. And when she closed her eyes, letting herself rest against the warmth of the cowboy who had once broken her heart, but returned to mend it, the town of Dry Creek no longer felt so empty, for love has a way of filling even the hollowest places. And though their story was only beginning again, it was enough. And if you've ridden this far with Clara and Luke, if their tale of staying, of loving, of daring to believe again in the face of loneliness struck a chord in your heart, then, partner, don't ride away just yet. Hit that subscribe button. Join this trail with us. Because out here in the Wild West, every love, every fight, every whisper is a story waiting to be told, and you won't want to miss the next one.